Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. It's been another busy and long week in Washington, from the debate about voting rights, which took place last night in the Senate, to my role as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, as we are very, very focused at this moment on actions around Ukraine and the not just American diplomatic effort, but NATO efforts as well, to warn Russia about the serious consequences that would come about if Russia invades or interferes dramatically in Ukraine. But I thought what I'd start with, though, is a couple things that are more, Virginia-centric, and give a couple updates, and then be happy to start taking your questions on any subject. First, something that obviously all Virginia families are feeling right now is the challenges around inflation. And the most important thing we can, I think, do to bring down inflation, and we've seen some choppiness in the market recently, which may actually be not all a bad sign, but will be actions of the Federal Reserve. And I look forward to supporting Jay Powell to continue as the Fed chairman. I think he brings a steady hand, but I think he also realizes if we are going to see the inflation start to come in check, we're going to have to use tools around monetary policy, and that will mean potentially cutting back raising interest rates, and that's been predicted now by a number of Fed board members, and slowing the so-called quantitative easing, bond purchasing activities of the Fed. Probably the most important tools in the toolkit, number one. But there are two other, I think, important tools that we also need to focus on. Just yesterday, I wrote a letter to the National Retail Federation, and this includes Walmart and Target, but all of the host of small and large retail establishments across Virginia, asking them what they're doing and what additional assistance we could provide on supply chain issues. We are still grappling with disruptions that have come from the COVID crisis. We obviously live in a global economy. As a matter of fact, I think about Hampton Roads with our port there. We're still seeing container prices moving from China to America being 2, 3, 4 times more than they were pre-COVID, because of disruptions that took place when the economy basically went into a freeze frame for a number of months. But I want to hear from the retailers if there are other tools that we can use to smooth out some of these supply chain issues. And on supply chain, I want to commend the president, because he has set up working groups on supply chain to see if there are actions, either legislatively or by executive order, that can help get out some of these kinks in the supply chain. One area where I'm glad to see the president finally focusing, that I've been working on for months, that will deal both with supply chain as well as national security concerns, and that is we need the House to pass the CHIPS bill. This important legislation, of which I was a key sponsor, has a series of research and development initiatives, but what would be the most timely and the most necessary is that it invest $52 billion in both development of next generation wireless technology, so-called 5G and O-RAN, but also close to $50 billion in semiconductor investments. That would be both research, and that would be to help build 8 to 10 new fabrication facilities, fabs they're called, for chips across the country. My hope is we would be able to get at least one of those new fabs. We've already seen Micron, one of the largest semiconductor manufacturers, which has a big presence in Manassas in Northern Virginia, has announced expansion plans. My hope is, whether it be Micron or another facility, we could get another fab facility somewhere in Virginia. How this relates to inflation is, I think anybody that's gone out and tried to buy a used car has seen probably some of the biggest inflation across the market take place in the used car market. Why is that? Well, part of it's because the new car market can't produce enough cars to meet current demand. Why is that? Not because our factories aren't prepared to produce those cars. They are. Matter of fact, there are cars sitting in lots across the Midwest. What are they missing? They're missing the semiconductors. So much of our cars now are computer driven. Without those semiconductor chips that make a lot of the functionality in the cars work, you can't deliver them into the marketplace. So passing the semiconductor legislation, while the fabs won't be built tomorrow, it will send a huge market signal, and relieve some of the pressure on the auto industry. So I wanted to speak a little bit about those activities in terms of inflation. Closer to home, there's also some good news, bad news happening. I was very proud to be one of the key senators that put together the once-in-a-generation infrastructure bill. And we're already seeing some of the benefits of that. It was announced, I believe, earlier this week that Virginia was going to receive $536 million to help us repair some of the decaying and almost unsafe bridges in Virginia. Matter of fact, VDOT indicated there are 577 bridges that are in various states of disrepair that need to be fixed up. We probably, each and every one of us, drive over one of those bridges each and every day. During advocacy for this program, I was down in Richmond at the over 100-year-old Mayo Bridge, which clearly needs repair. $536 million of new funding coming forward will help Virginia take that 577 bridges that are in decaying shape and actually get them repaired. Critically important, both for getting to and from work and to and from school, or getting the kids to school, but just improving the overall economy as well. In addition, and this is for Hampton Roads, we've been working really hard on two projects in Hampton Roads. One is the Norfolk flood project. We all know the activities that have come about from sea level rise in Norfolk to protect Norfolk. There's a very ambitious over $1 billion project around resiliency. The Army Corps announced, I believe it was close to $250 million that will go to Norfolk on a huge deposit on getting that seawall and sea level rise mitigation in place. The other project that we have been working on, and this is one where, frankly, the previous administration, Virginia got an unfair short end of the stick, and that is the widening of the harbor and making sure the port remains world class. We got $69 million on the Norfolk Port project. That is a huge investment. There will be, I believe, additional funds coming from the president's budget when it gets released in a few weeks. So good news for Hampton Roads. What's still at risk, though, and if we go back to the infrastructure project and the infrastructure bill, there's lots of additional money for highways, there's lots of additional money for transit, but if Congress doesn't go ahead and pass a new spending bill, what we call now an omnibus, where we take all the spending bills for the balance of this fiscal year, which ends on September 30th. So we're already about 40% through the year. We need to get our act together and get it done. We in Virginia could lose literally hundreds of millions of dollars from increased highway funding, increased transit funding. And the reason is, if we don't pass a new spending bill, what we have to revert to is what's called a continuing resolution, which means we're just going to continue last year's appropriation levels. That obviously will hurt us on infrastructure. Many again realize how this hurts us in the defense budget, because if a project's already run its course and a new project is starting, if you have a CR, that new project doesn't get funded. So I do think there's a lot of bipartisan interest in making sure we get this so-called omnibus put together, and we've got another fairly quick timeline. It's somewhere in the mid-February where our current funding runs out, and we've got to provide that overall omnibus funding, which will again put more money from the infrastructure bill directly into Virginia's economy. So wanted to raise those couple of issues around inflation, around some of the benefits of the infrastructure investment, trying to make sure that we get the House to pass the semiconductor bill, which also has enormous national security implications vis-a-vis China. But I know there's a lot of other issues. So Val, why don't we go ahead and start the questioning?
Hi there. Yeah, thank you for taking my question. And I'm new, so nice to virtually meet you here. Just wanted to ask you, does it seem to you like Democrats are in trouble right now? Obviously, President Biden is touting a number of achievements, but there are a lot of things that haven't been done, and a lot of people are pointing to the recent governor race there in your own state of Virginia as an indicator that, people aren't hearing those accomplishments.
Well, I think if you could roll back the tape a little bit, and the administration had set a set of expectations that said, okay, how are we going to deal economically with the COVID crisis? How are we going to make sure that we do a once, not in a generation, but once in 50-year infrastructure plan? How would we make sure that we repair NATO so that if we see an emerging challenge like Putin's and Russia's potential invasion of Ukraine, if those had been the expectations that were set, I think that the president approval ratings would probably be 10 or 15 points higher. Because those are all, if you look from any historic perspective, a pretty darn good year for a first year of a presidency. But the president had a much more extensive, ambitious agenda out there, particularly on what was called the second half of his economic agenda. And in a lot of those areas, I very much support making sure we deal with climate change, trying to get more folks back into the workforce. You're not going to get more folks back in the workforce, particularly women workers, until you can deal with child care. The number of child care centers around Virginia, around the country, are still dramatically down, still is a tail from COVID. And there's been some challenges there. And we have, to say a thin majority in the Senate is an understatement. When you got a 50-50 Senate, you can't lose anyone. And we saw the ramifications of that last night on some of the voting rights legislation. And I am enormously concerned that what's happening in other states, the Georgias, the Texases, where people are, there's efforts to dramatically cut back the rights of voters to have free and easy access to the polls, where the business communities in those states have spoken out against those changes. I think is kind of anti the sense of who we are in America in terms of a democracy. And I point out repeatedly that expanding voting rights doesn't favor one party over another. In Virginia, this year's gubernatorial race, we had 25% more voters than in 2017. And the result was, as you pointed out, the Republicans had a clean sweep. So I just wish my Republican friends, who, again, I'm proud of my bipartisan record on all of these issues, but my Republican friends would realize that expanding voting rights actually should be good for democracy overall, not for one party over another. And my fear is that too many of my Republican colleagues are still intimidated by the power that Donald Trump has over the Republican Party. And while they may all express privately to me that they have huge concerns about this Trump overhang, that's not translated to them breaking and voting on voting rights issues. I do think there is a chance. I think the president tried yesterday to do a reset. And a number of these issues, which I am deeply engaged in at this point, I think you'll start to see some points being put on the board in the coming weeks, and I'll have more to say about that later.
Okay, the next question. I'm so sorry. We have just a lot of questions. Yeah, we just have a ton of questions, so we just need to move on, unfortunately.
Excuse me, folks. Hey, Val. Val, hold. I need you all to, I'm having a really hard time hearing, so if one person at a time, and if Val could identify who I'm speaking to, that would be really helpful.
Yes, we were moving on to the next question, and that comes from Dominga at NBC 29.
Yes, thank you so much, Senator Warner, for taking my question. So NBC 29 News is in Charlottesville, very close to Emerald County. People who live in town are getting about 4 days of mail every 12 days or so. I know that you came to town in late fall and pushed seasonal workers into USPS to help with holiday backup, and that worked very well. But now that the seasonal employees are gone, these issues are sort of returning. Do you have any mitigation plans or plan to revisit the area?
Well, let me just correct one thing. I mean, it was not a single visit to Charlottesville. My first visit on this mail issue was in August, September timeframe. I came back in November. We know the post office, particularly in a community like Charlottesville, you got a great economy going there. Recruiting and retaining postal workers has been a problem across the country, but even more in a place like Charlottesville where you've got so many other job opportunities. We really focused hard, and there were a number of postal employees, as you pointed out, that came in during the season, and mail delivery got better, although I know even then there was some problems, like, for example, in Crozet and a couple of other communities. The post office and the district manager were in the midst of hiring, my memory was like over 20 additional carriers, and there were another 10 to 12 positions that were about to be filled. I'm very disappointed that we've seen this slippage in mail service. As I've said to the post office before, I'm going to keep coming back until this gets resolved. It was interesting to me that at a macro level, the new members of the Postal Service Board at the national level, these are even the members that were appointed by President Biden, reaffirmed the Postmaster General, Mr. DeJoy, who I have huge problems with, his contract. I actually felt that they might come in and remove Mr. DeJoy. There are clearly long-term structural problems with our Postal Service. People don't send as much mail as they used to. The number of purchases that take place over the internet, a lot of the revenue that were generated when people would send out kind of the catalogs and other mail has dropped dramatically. So, Congress still has to make some moves in terms of structural reform, in terms of the pension plans around the post office. That doesn't answer the folks in Charlottesville and Albemarle, who I read that just today in the press. Somebody said the mail got better and they've only gotten 4 days out of the last 12. I intend to be back in Charlottesville over the next 30 to 45 days. I'm going to sit down with the post office again. But I can assure you my frustration level may not be as great as some of the folks in the community who are not getting the mail on a timely basis. But my patience is running thin. We know there are other problems around Virginia, but no place has been consistently as problematic as Charlottesville. So, we need to hire more folks, but if they need to actually bring in on a permanent basis additional carriers and sorters, that has to happen, because it just, the post office predates the Constitution. It's I believe the only federal agency was even named in the Constitution, and folks deserve better.
The next question comes from Mitchell Miller at WTOP.
Hi, good morning, Senator. If I could, I'd just like to get in two quick questions on two major issues. One is, as you know, the President indicated yesterday that he would be willing to break up the Build Back Better plan. I wonder what your thoughts are on that. And then also in connection with the situation internationally that I know you're watching very closely, Secretary of State Blinken is going to meet with the Russian foreign minister tomorrow. What are your concerns there, and what message do you think that the U.S. should be sending along with its allies? Obviously, there was a little bit of a concern related to some of the President's comments yesterday.
Well, let me take them in order, Mitchell. The component parts of the President's Build Back Better program are very popular. People want additional child care or preschool. People want to make sure the cost of prescription drugs comes down. We're the only major industrial nation in the world that doesn't negotiate on our drug prices. That would be an immediate benefit for all families, no matter where you live, no matter what kind of income stream you have. I think the vast majority of Virginians, and whether we call it sea level rise or we've seen storms that are taking place, we got to deal with climate change. It is an existential threat. The challenge with breaking the program up, though, is the fact that we've not been able to gain any Republican support, and consequently the ability to pass pieces of this bill without using the process tool called reconciliation, which would allow us to pass this with 51 votes, kind of comes unwound. So I'm not sure that breaking it up, it might mean that people in the House could talk about what they voted for, but at the end of the day, we want these things to become law. And I still think there may be a chance for a smaller, more targeted package to get through. I think you may see some things on that coming in the next couple of weeks. I've been a long-time advocate that the program ought to do less things in a more targeted and focused way. Not only because it's easier to talk about in terms of what's in the program, but as a governor who knows how you actually operationalize laws, the challenge often is, passing the law is only the beginning, as we saw, for example, with Obamacare. Unless it's implemented correctly, you don't get the benefits that folks hope. So I've been very concerned that if the federal government tried to implement 15, 20 new initiatives at the same time, the chances of success would go down. So I think a more targeted, slimmed down package may be still the best way to go, but if that effort is not successful literally in a few weeks, then breaking it into chunks, recognizing that when those chunks came over to the Senate, you could only use reconciliation on one of them individually. On the second issue, and I think the president, I think you saw the White House, clarify some of the president's comments, because one of the things we're looking at is we're concerned about Russian invasion of Ukraine, and I believe an invasion could take the form of taking over the whole country, taking over a portion of Kiev, taking over part of the eastern region, the Donbass, where there's already been fighting for years. But it also could mean other actions, such as cyber attacks. It could mean an attempt to try to get rid of the Zelensky government in Ukraine. And one of the things I don't think the president has gotten enough credit for is that the fact is he has unified NATO. What's been one of the amazing things that have amazed me for some time is the Ukrainian government didn't even take as seriously as it should the threat that the Russian intervention could be imminent. It only has been the last few weeks that I think the Ukrainians have recognized how serious this threat is. But what was also a real challenge is Donald Trump constantly dissed and undermined NATO. So you got Joe Biden coming in, spending a year trying to rebuild that coalition. And I can assure you, as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, trying to rally all of NATO 6 months ago to this cause, or 3 months ago as we saw the Russians start to build up their forces, was a real big challenge. Our British allies were immediately with us. Took a little while longer to get the French on board. The most reluctant were the Germans, because there was a new government in Germany. Germany's got a much closer economic ties with Russia. But now you've got the Germans involved, as well as the other 28 nations in NATO in a united front. That didn't happen overnight. That didn't happen without a lot of activity. And what I think you're seeing happen right now, because you could see Russian provocation happen at any moment, particularly in terms of cyber or what's so-called false flag, where you might have Russian troops go in, misidentifying themselves as Ukrainians and actually creating an incident that would give an excuse for Russia to invade. I mean, that false flag operation. But what I think is happening right now is we are flooding the zone, whether Secretary Blinken, some of my Democratic and Republican senators who were in Kiev earlier this week, the German foreign minister, so that if you're meeting on an almost daily basis, or having senior Western officials in Ukraine on almost a daily basis, I think that is making Russia at least pause. End of the day, the truth is the ultimate decider of what's going to happen in terms of Russians' activities are Vladimir Putin. Knowing what he will decide is a challenge. This is the kind of play he likes to keep everybody a little bit off balance. One of the things that I'm concerned about, and we've seen this in some of the intelligence, is that there are members of the Russian intelligence services that I think realize that it's not like the Ukrainians are going to greet Russians with open arms. The level of antipathy towards Russia and Ukraine has gone up year after year after year, even including in the East. And I'm fearful that Putin still has this image that the Russians are going to go in and be viewed as welcoming heroes. That is not the case, and I'm horribly afraid that Putin might make a miscalculation because he's not getting accurate information. This is a guy that folks are so afraid of telling the truth to. He's kind of a Donald Trump on steroids, and that could lead to a serious miscalculation. So this constant effort of bringing in diplomats, continuing to engage diplomatically, continuing to make clear how serious the consequences will be, I think is absolutely appropriate action at this point. And should Russia invade, then we need that totally united NATO front, as well as other major nations in the world, to come down like a ton of bricks on Russia. There has to be serious consequences.
Okay, the next question comes from Dean at WRIC.
Hi, Senator Warner. Thanks for taking the time. I want to go back to inflation. Inflation rose 7% over the last year. Retail sales have dropped. Prices have climbed. I know that President Biden spoke a bit about this yesterday, saying that, anticipating that, changes that the Fed made during the pandemic, it's appropriate for the Fed to recalibrate the support that is now necessary, I believe he said. I'm wondering what you think, besides raising interest rates, the Fed has at its disposal, and the federal government and Congress, what tools and what kind of approach can be taken to help the people that are feeling the impact of inflation?
And well, I think it's interesting. I'm old enough to remember when we saw skyrocketing inflation back in the late 70s. And let me just give you, I don't want to wonk out too much here, but let's go ahead and at least set the table a little bit. The last time we saw this level of inflation in the late 70s, you were seeing mortgage rates, for example, at 12, 13%. They even went up to as high as about 17%. Mortgage rates in this country are still at historic lows around 3%. So the market is saying this inflation is not going to last. You'll never hear me use, I think, the word transitory. I think, the Fed officials used it. It was a bad word, because this is going to take longer than we'd hoped. But the market itself, hasn't baked in the long-term, or doesn't believe long-term this inflation is going to remain, or you would see interest rates on mortgages go up dramatically. Secondly, while you've seen some choppiness in the market the last couple of days because the Fed has said they will raise interest rates 3 or 4 times over the next year, we're still a year out. I think I heard today, the Dow Jones is up about 12%. The S&P, I think, is up about 16% over the year. Those are historic highs. So again, the market is still saying this is an underlying strong economy. So the Fed's biggest tool is raising interest rates. The second tool, and again, I think Jay Powell, one of the reasons I support him is, it was all hands on deck at the beginning of COVID when the whole economy froze. And this is one of the areas I'll give President Trump credit for, and particularly as Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin. We put a bunch of money, about $5 trillion, into the economy, support programs for small businesses, PPP, those checks that were written to individual Americans. Americans have got a lot more money in their pocket today, frankly, on average, particularly low and moderate income Americans, than they had even pre-COVID. That's a long-term good. Short-term, it keeps price pressures on. But the other tool that the Fed could use is they have been buying, it's called quantitative easing, to keep interest rates remarkably low by buying up debt. on a regular basis. Jay Powell has said they will tail that off. I hope they would tail it off earlier. He's talking about the first quarter now. So I think you can see those kind of Fed activities being important. The other area, and that's why I come back to my letter to the National Retail Federation, it's why I came back to the semiconductor bill, is there are huge disruptions in a global supply chain. And one of the most important things we could do, particularly vis-a-vis cars, but also semiconductor chips are in refrigerators, they're in TVs, they're in cell phones, you name it, they're there. If America stepped up and said, short-term and long-term, we're going to invest and make sure that we've got a strong semiconductor industry right here in America. Right now, the biggest place for semiconductors in the whole world is Taiwan. One of the reasons why China is being so aggressive against Taiwan. China itself is putting up, $100 billion to try to, grow their own semiconductor industry. If we don't invest in semiconductor facilities here, we've seen our share of the market go from about 33% down to 12%. That's long-term as a security issue, but it's also a signal to the market that this chip shortage may continue. So the actions that the Congress could take is working with retailers, other providers, about how we can smooth out supply chain. One area in particular we ought to focus on, if you're looking at those high prices of used cars, it would be passing the CHIPS bill, as well as the important message it would send to the rest of the world that America, with our allies, is going to step up against China. We have two adversarial threats right now, Russia and China. Obviously, we've going to other nations like Iran, North Korea, the threat of terrorism, the threat of domestic violent extremists. A lot of things on your plate, but China and Russia, and China in particular, we've had military threats before, but we've never had the kind of economic challenge. China's got an economy that is almost the equivalent of ours, and at some point may even pass ours just because of its size and population. We have to be willing to go toe-to-toe. And when I say China, let me make clear, my beef is with the Communist Party of China, Xi Jinping. It is not with the Chinese people, and obviously not with the Chinese diaspora, Chinese Americans, or other Asian Americans who, unfortunately, in this climate have been the victims of a lot of abuse.
Okay, the next question comes from Michael Martz at the Richmond Times-Dispatch.
Yes, good morning, Senator. I wanted to follow up on your discussion about the CHIPS bill because I was surprised that it stalled in the House. It appeared to come out of the Senate with some strength and the bipartisan support. I understand that the White House may have slowed it down. Can you explain why, how that happened, and why?
Michael, well, let's put it like this. Bipartisan, it had 68 votes in the Senate. This is a national security bill, it's a research bill, it's a supply chain bill. And the reason why it got held up a bit in the House was because the research part, there is a valid debate about, as we think about advanced research, not just in semiconductors, but in artificial intelligence and quantum computing, in a host of other incredibly important areas. There is a legitimate debate that says, should we put those funds through the National Science Foundation? Should we put more of those funds through the Department of Energy, our national labs? How should we work with academia? And the House had one version, the Senate had another. What I got frustrated with, and I think the Biden administration was focused on other items, and I've been urging every time I've been with the president, we can get you a win, but we can also send a strong national security issue and also start to get cars back into folks' hands at a cheaper price if we pass this bipartisan legislation. If we have to go ahead and say, let's take the research discussions that are involved in what's called USICA, this bill vis-a-vis China. Let's spend a little more time on those and debate those out. There's not as much imminent requirement there, but let's take that $52 billion on 5G and next generation telecom. We've read a lot about this discussions around 5G networks in the airports. We need to move beyond even 5G to what's called open radio access networks. To stay competing against China. That's got Huawei trying. That is a huge security challenge and economic challenge for us around the world. let's go ahead and get that money into 5G and into the semiconductors now. Because just the fact, Michael, that we passed this in July and we are now, 7 months after that? We have lost in America the chance to secure some of these additional chip manufacturing facilities. They're called fabs, because other nations have stepped up. This is not just an American issue. I mean, South Korea is putting up, I believe it was $60 billion. Taiwan continues to expand. China, I mentioned, put up $100 billion. The Netherlands is putting up tens of billions of dollars. UK is putting up money. Canada's got an effort here. This is a global competition. And when these fabrication facilities cost literally $15 billion plus to build, operate, you lose money on them for a few years until you go cash flow positive. If we don't step up, these facilities will be built elsewhere in the world. That's not good for security. That's not good for inflation. That's not good for secure supply chain issues. And I do think the White House has turned its attention to this issue. I talked with the leadership of the House just this week. So let's take the most critical component, chips and 5G, and if we have to have a further debate about where the research funds, how they ought to be distributed, let's have that debate, but let's not waste any more time on this national security supply chain issue and issue that would show the rest of the world that America is back in terms of its research component, at least in one area, on semiconductors, which is so critical. Sorry to go that long on that one, but it has been more than a bit frustrating.
Okay, we have a number of questions still remaining, and we will try to get to as many of these as possible. The next one comes from Caroline Tucker at NBC.
Hi, Senator Warner. Good morning to you. I think some of the questions have already been asked that I was looking at, but, you've been talking about, this frustration that a lot of people have been facing, especially in Virginia, about the cost of goods. It's more expensive to go to the grocery store, gas, everything's just costing everyone more. Is there any talk right now at all about the chance of a fourth stimulus check at all?
There are clearly businesses that are still struggling because of the surge of Omicron. I can tell you, going out to restaurants, you don't see the same number of people in the last week as I saw, in the beginning of December. We've seen enterprises like gyms and other facilities that have seen dramatic cutbacks. But there's some talk now of additional assistance for some of these institutions, although I would be more interested in cheap long-term debt. There's a program called the EIDL program out of the Small Business Association that would give you a couple years of no interest and principal repayment, a interest rate of about 3.75%, I believe, and a 30-year time to pay that off. So I would be more interested in a debt component to these entities than another grant. But I don't think, at least I've not heard any serious conversation that the federal government is going to go out and simply write checks across the board. Again, I know checks are very popular. Who doesn't like free money? But if you look at the kind of savings rate of Americans, particularly low-income and moderate-income Americans, who've really been, I think, very thoughtful in terms of paying down debt, getting a little bit of reserve in place, but you put more cash into the economy directly with checks, what you do is you spur inflation at an even higher rate. So I think any additional relief ought to be targeted, particularly those enterprises that still can't get back to normal because of the Omicron. My hope is, as we've seen kind of Omicron go through my staff, go through my family, a couple of my daughters got it for the second time, even though they got COVID, even though they are fully vaccinated and boosted. But I think we're seeing some of those numbers decline. I hope we follow the trend. But I think we should be any additional relief obviously has to be very targeted, and I'm much more looking at debt than grants. And again, towards businesses, enterprises, more than kind of a broad base, write everybody a check.
The next question comes from Daniel at WDBJ.
Good morning, Senator Warner. So the voting rights legislation, as we all know, was defeated, but the effort to restrict the right to vote, they're still happening in state houses across the country. So I guess my question, are there discussions about what's next now that the vote has failed?
Well, first of all, my hope and prayer, and I want Governor Youngkin to be successful, but I just hope and pray that there are not these kind of crazy efforts that would step up in Virginia to try to restrict people's right to vote. I point out the fact that in 2021 we had the biggest turnout ever in Virginia. A lot of that was due to lots more early voting on weekends, the ability to use drop boxes, and that helped the Republican candidates, both at the statewide level and in the House of Delegates. And our elections are secure. So I hope there is not an effort to promote the Trump big lie about elections in Virginia, number one. Number two, there are ongoing conversations. I've talked to a lot of my Republican friends around what's called, I think it was the Electoral College Act and a couple of other component parts where there is huge concern, where you see some of these states saying, we're going to turn over to the state legislature, a partisan entity, who gets to determine who won the state, not an independent election board, or some of that even taking place at the county level, where the local election officials, often always bipartisan, always independent, are going to get pushed aside, and a partisan body would come to pass there. I've heard from my friend Senator Baldwin in Wisconsin, where there is a sheriff going around trying to arrest election officials out of the 2020 election. That's crazy. That's something you read about in a third world nation. So there are some conversations about bipartisan, making sure that we have independent bodies certify election results. I support that. I may be part of those efforts. But certification of the elections is only half the problem if the actual rights of people to vote in an accessible, easy way is undermined. In Georgia, the data shows that black voters in Georgia wait 4 and 5 times longer in line than white voters. You've got a number of jurisdictions where Senator Warnock from Georgia spoke extraordinarily eloquently last night about states that are, in Georgia in particular, where they're trying to cut down the number of polling stations, particularly in minority neighborhoods. I mean, that's about cutting back folks' access to voting. And that is so anti what it means to be an American, and it's so counter to what President Reagan, President George H.W. Bush, President George W. Bush, they all voted and supported passage of voting rights legislation, extension of the Voting Rights Act, usually by a unanimous basis. What has happened in America where folks have kind of come into this big lie just because Donald Trump lost and you can't accept that fact, and we're seeing this legislation take place around the country that should scare the heck out of all of us, because right now it's happening in Republican states. God forbid if those states that are controlled by Democrats suddenly said, we're going to use those same tools. That is on a path towards the destruction of our democracy.
Okay, we have time for just one more question. We unfortunately didn't get to all of them, but our office is happy to help anyone who didn't get to ask.
And my apologies, everybody, because I know I've been given a little bit longer answers than I should, but go ahead.
And the last question will come from Madison at WSET.
Hi, Senator Warner. Just one question for you. I know that here in Lynchburg we had the issue with the Amtrak earlier this month, those multiple passengers stuck on the Amtrak during that snow event. I was wondering, I know you reached out to Amtrak for comment. Is there any update on the investigation or anything from Amtrak on your end?
I've been a huge supporter of Amtrak, and I'm glad we've got better service to Lynchburg. I'm glad with the infrastructure bill we're going to be able to extend train service, rail service to Christiansburg. My hope is we get it all the way down to Bristol. And there is no excuse for the fact that these folks were caught on that train all night without access to food and water, that there was no relief provided. I understand the train didn't get all the way back to Lynchburg Station, but it was close enough that you could have gotten relief. And Amtrak has acknowledged mistakes were made, but they have not given me a formal response to Senator Kane and my letter, and my patience is wearing very thin. I'm going to be back in touch with Amtrak this week, and I expect an answer because if we're going to make this additional investment, which we need, we've got to make sure that the safety of the passengers who ride on rail is guaranteed. And what happened during that snowstorm, you can't prevent the storm, you can't prevent a tree from falling on the tracks. Those things will happen. But you can ensure that you can get relief to people because you know where the train is, you know where it's stopped. To not have any kind of ongoing communications on a regular basis just isn't an acceptable answer. Well, let me again say thanks to all of you. I'm sorry that those of you who I didn't get a chance to answer a question, if you can get those questions to Val, we can try to answer them offline. Let's all, particularly my friends kind of Richmond and towards Hampton Roads, I'm headed down those communities tomorrow and over the weekend. I'm hoping not to do a mini Tim Kaine and have to sit in my car on 95 or 64 for hours on end, but hopefully the weather may break a little bit differently. But everybody stay safe and more to come. Thank you all.